بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to The Conviction Project. I am Marij Rana and I am here with my friend the Imam, Farhan Iqbal. Farhan, Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Farhan, last time we were talking about sexual assault, we were talking about the Me Too movement, and this time we had said, okay, we will take a different perspective and talk about probably, I would say, one of the most predominant allegations against Islam, which is against this idea of wife beating or beating women in general. And, I think before we get to that stage where we talk about domestic violence between couples, I think it's important to talk about violence between individuals or just the violent nature of human beings. I think many people are very uncomfortable with the idea of the potential that human beings have when it comes to being violent. For example, if someone is really annoying you and you feel like, well, I am just going to hit you, and this thought, it just comes at you like an impulse. And you don't do it, but the thought comes. And, the idea is very salient. The only thing that's between you and being violent is just restraining yourself. And I think that when we live in 2018 and we live in the societies that we live in, it becomes a lot more easier to restrain ourselves. I imagine if we don't have those same restraints, then the capacity to be violent is very large. What do you think about that initially?
Yeah, actually, when I think about this topic, as you just mentioned, the potential for violence is there, and it's something that is not as uncommon as we would like to think. I think domestic violence is a problem. I've seen some statistics about domestic violence, which is increased in those cases where there is alcohol, for instance. If alcohol gets involved, the emotions are not in check, and both men and women can become violent with their spouses. And so this is a problem. And so before even talking about it from an Islamic perspective, I think from a human perspective, we need to understand that this is a human problem. This is a domestic violence. I think we talked about it a little bit in one of our episodes earlier as well. This is a human problem. This is something that all of us should be concerned about. And before raising any fingers about any particular religion or culture or society, we need to understand this is probably part of every society. In fact, there are certain societies where obviously the men are dominating and the women are the ones who are dominated. And there are some societies where the women are dominating. And in those cases, women may become violent with their husbands. And so this is a problem. I think from a psychological perspective, we need to understand that this is something that exists and impacts a lot of people.
And, when we talk about the Islamic perspective, we have to, I guess, go back 1,500 years to the very people that this verse was revealed to. What was the nature of those people? What type of societies did they live in? And what kind of things did they have? I talked about our society and I said, well, there's a lot of restraints put on us which kind of monitor or guide our violent impulses. But I wonder, and I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on, do you think that the same restraints were there in Arabia, in 6th century Arabia?
Actually, if we study the Arabic society, like the Arab society before the coming of Islam, I mean, I don't want to generalize this about the whole of the Middle East. What I'm talking about is maybe particular areas in Saudi Arabia where men were violent in the sense that their lives were very difficult. and there were Bedouins, and there were tribal movements all the time happening, and so it was a very tribal society, which was in some cases constantly at war. There were, for instance, two tribes in the city of Medina before Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, got to Medina. Sometime before that, there were the two main Arab tribes were constantly at war for like 40 years. So there were these tribal tensions that were always there, and these men in those societies were very dominating and were warrior-like, and they had certain tendencies, and some of those tendencies included subjugating women, treating them unfairly, treating them as second-class citizens. In some cases, even burying their daughters alive, and this is something that exists. It's a problem. Just yesterday, BBC News reported how 21 million girls in India are unwanted, in the sense that those couples who have those girls actually want boys, and so this is a problem in certain cultures and societies and environments. Yeah.
And, oftentimes people talk about PTSD, and that is a huge thing. And I know we're sidetracking, but I think this is an important point to make before we get to the actual point of Islam's stance on domestic violence. But people talk about PTSD, and they say, well, why is it that in Arabia or in the Middle Ages or in medieval times, there was no real concept of PTSD? And I think that part of the reason why is because there was consistency. What your daily life was very typical from what your life was at war. And now when you come to the 21st century, your daily life is very different from your life at war. So then when you come back to your daily life, your brain mechanisms and your psychology is all disrupted. So I think it's a very important distinction to make that the restraints of Arab society back in the time of early Islam was very different than our time. There's this thing that's coming, vivid picture that's coming to my mind, was of Abu Sufyan's wife, Hind, biting into the liver of Hazrat Hamza. So this is just to give like a minute example of the type of society that was present. And I think it's a good segue to start talking about, okay, well, in that society, why is it that Islam allowed chastisement or beating a woman, or what did it say stop? What was the stance in that society that Islam took?
So here's a point that needs to be established, that the first addressees of the Quran were these Arabs, and or a segment of those Arabs, right? Again, the word Arab today refers to a lot of people. Sometimes people consider all the people in the Middle East as Arabs. So I just want to emphasize this point. We're not making a generalization. The specific people who were the addressees of the Quran at the time of Prophet Muhammad, the Quran had to deal with them first. They were the first addressees. And so some of the commandments that came were related to them. Of course, they can be seen in a universal light as well. There is this tension even in Judaism. I was reading recently about the universalism versus particularism and these kind of things. So the Quran is a universal book. There's no doubt about that. But the first addressees, the first people the Quran had to reform, were the Arabs. And this verse of the Quran, which is from chapter 4, verse 35, we have read this verse before as well, parts of it, and it's a long verse. I'll just take the segment which can be controversial to certain people. The Quran says, وَاللَّاتِي تَخَافُونَ نُشُوزَهُنَّ فَعِظُوهُنَّ وَاهْجُرُوهُنَّ فِي الْمَضَاجِعِ وَاضْرِبُوهُنَّ. So in context, it says, virtuous women are those who are obedient, guard the secrets of their husbands with Allah's protection. And as for those on whose part you fear disobedience, admonish them and leave them alone in their beds and chastise them. This is the controversy or the controversial part of the Quran. And we got a lot of questions about this, and we thought that today we would just quickly discuss it, and almost we are running out of time. But let me quickly mention, so this is the first point, that The Quran is saying that is addressing the Arabs who are violent with their wives, and the Quran is trying to actually create a deterrent. The Quran is actually trying to create steps so that they avoid this kind of behavior. Why is that? Because if we read the verse carefully, and in Arabic, there is the style of Arabic is such that it teaches things in steps. So in this verse, the first step that a husband is to take regarding his wife who is disobedient is to admonish her. Right? You see, if a person gets angry and is about to strike his wife, if a man gets angry and is about to, in the spur of the moment, he's about to strike his wife, the Quran says, stop. First, admonish or advise. What admonish means, just talk to her, try to work things out, and calm down and talk about it, basically. Give advice. And then if that does not work, the Quran doesn't say, okay, now you can do it. No, the Quran says, now the next step is to separate your beds. Instead of sleeping together, you should be sleeping on separate beds. And so this is a deterrent. This creates that environment where the man's anger would just subside and go away. I mean, if they separate their beds just for a few days, let alone a week or 10 days, the thing that caused the anger would just go away.
I also think that, separation in itself is so crucial for the safety of women in general. If there is violence between couples, separation is actually a huge part of safety. I work with couples where domestic violence exists, and the first thing that we do is we create a safety plan, and part of that safety plan is separating and being in different areas. And oftentimes I ask women who are involved in intimate partner violence, is there another room that you can stay in or be in where you can be alone and where you can feel safe? So I think that's also part of the idea of establishing safety.
Yeah, and so it's actually a deterrent, especially with the first addressees of the Quran who are men, warrior-like men, who are told to do this so that it helps calm them down and never get to the third point, which is chastisement. That third level is for an extreme situation, a very rare situation. And even in this case, when we look at the life of Prophet Muhammad, he's the role model here. What did he do? He would advise his wife, advise them in such scenarios. And at the most, we find an example in the life of Prophet Muhammad where he separated himself and he secluded himself and went to a separate room and did not communicate with his wives for a period of time. And he never got to the point of chastisement. Chastisement is a very extreme and rare occurrence. And again, to finish it off, when does that happen? Well, I would like to quote Mirza Tahir Ahmad, the fourth caliph of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. He said that in the Punjabi culture from Pakistan and India, there are women who are called kapatis. He quoted that. And who is a kapati? A woman who is like extremely bad in her behavior, in her treatment of her husband. She's constantly fighting with him. She's constantly bothering him, and the man who's trying to be humble tries to advise her and then tries to leave off the bed and get to a different room, and even then she keeps on doing that. And the word nushuz is there earlier in the same verse, which is talking about extreme disobedience, which goes to the level of extramarital affairs and those kind of things that if we look at the dictionary. And those are the situations which are very, very rare and very extreme that this is allowed. And even then the Prophet has said that if it gets to that level, make sure that if you do chastise your wife, it does not leave any mark on her body, which makes it completely symbolic at the end of the day.
So I have a lot of questions, and I know we're running out of time. And I think we probably would have to do this in parts, and we will actually do this in parts because I think this is a longer conversation, and it is a
Exactly.
conversation which requires depth. So the first point, which I think we should start with our next podcast, is this idea of obedience. I think that this needs to be highlighted because this is the first part. If your wife is disobedient, then you admonish her, then you separate beds, and then you chastise her. So, what is disobedient? Is disobedient merely this idea of not listening to someone? Does a wife have to be obedient in Islam? These are thoughts that are running through my mind, and I'm sure it's running through the minds of many of our listeners who may have doubts about these ideas.
Yeah, I think we really need to break this down. And I said a lot of things in the last couple of minutes because I wanted to get some points across. But again, I need to explain and we need to discuss more each aspect of how this is happening. But just to clear the air here, it's a very psychologically motivated verse. I think it has a lot of psychology in it, and we need to understand it from that perspective.
And what does chastisement even mean? That's also a question that's running through our mind. But I think today what we established was we set the stage that human beings have the potential to be violent. And the restraint that is put on us to guide and monitor our violence is by our society. And the society we live in now, in Canada, may be very different from societies, say, in Pakistan, where I'm originally from, where you're originally from, and societies that could be, in rural Africa or rural Canada or rural United States even. All societies have different kind of restraints put on them in their ability to be violent. In Texas, you can open carry your firearm, so the restraints are very different. And I know we're running out of time, so we will continue this discussion on talking about obedience. And if any doubts do come up regarding this conversation, or if you're deeply impacted by any of the things we have said, we would love to hear from you.
In fact, a friend of mine recently did give some feedback, and it was amazing. And I would love to know this. And if any of you have a question, or if you disagree with anything that we did say, even today we might have said a lot of things that people disagree with. Please do let us know so that we can talk more about those areas where we were not clear enough.
Absolutely. Once again, this is the Conviction Project, where we leave you with no doubts about Islam.
الحق من ربك فلا تكونن من الممترين.
It is the truth from thy Lord. Be not therefore of those who doubt.